All right, listeners, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling Joan of Arc,
Joan of Arc.
but with a bit of a twist.
A twist.
Well, we're ditching the textbooks this time and diving into a 1950s comic book about her life.
A comic book.
Yep, you heard that right. Classics Illustrated from 1950. They were like,
Oh, I know those.
yeah,
Yeah, like Cliff's Notes, but with visuals.
oh, exactly.
Makes you wonder what they chose to highlight.
Right, like what did they emphasize about Joan of Arc back then?
And maybe even how those 1950s American values seeped into the story.
Oh, yeah, there's got to be some of that in there.
Definitely.
Well, okay, so first things first, how does this comic introduce Joan? Is it historically accurate at all, or are they taking some creative liberties?
Well, they definitely don't waste any time. They show her right away leading the charge, French flag, waving behind her, this determined look on her face.
So like a classic hero shot.
Totally sword raised high, almost like a superhero striking a pose.
Interesting. I mean, it's not exactly subtle, is it?
Well, think about it. This comic came out just a few years after World War II.
Oh, right.
America was in that post-war period, and the idea of heroic figures, especially female ones like Wonder Woman, was really big.
Makes sense. So they're tapping into that whole hero fascination.
Exactly. Joan of Arc, like the medieval Wonder Woman fighting for France, it makes her story relatable and exciting for a 1950 audience.
And it plays up that whole powerful, inspirational figure angle, which was a big part of her story.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the specifics here. The comic actually shows Joan directing troops at the Siege of Orleans. They even have a panel where she's adjusting the angle of a cannon.
Yeah, that's where we got to separate the comic book flair from the actual history. I mean, Joan was a skilled leader, no doubt, but siege warfare back then was way more complicated.
So they're simplifying things a bit.
For sure, it's storytelling, You can't exactly squeeze a whole military treatise into a comic panel.
Yeah, good point. So we've got Joan, the inspiring leader, maybe with some exaggerated military genius. But how about the other side of the conflict, the English? How are they depicted?
Let's just say it's not very flattering.
Oh.
They've got these sinister expressions, dark, spiky armor, almost demonic looking, and the text calls them cruel and barbaric.
Wow, so like straight-up villains?
Pretty much.
I wonder if there's more to it than just a simple good versus evil thing.
Possibly. Remember, this is post-World War II America. The alliance with Britain was strong, but the memories of the war were still fresh.
So even though it's a historical story, those portrayals of the English could be influenced by those feelings.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that we should always consider the source of information and when it was created.
Okay, so far we've got heroic John versus the villainous English, but what about those more personal parts of her journey, like her trek to the Dauphin? Does the comic show any of that?
Oh, yeah, they do. They condense it, of course, but you see her going through forests, villages, meeting all sorts of people along the way.
Ah, so like a classic road trip montage.
Yeah, exactly, capturing those key moments visually.
It must have been quite a journey, just picturing her on horseback, all determined.
Oh, and speaking of determination, there's this one panel that really stuck with me. It's the scene where Joan finally meets the Dauphin, and she's proclaiming her divine mission.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It's the way they positioned her right.
Exactly.
She's standing taller than him.
Like she's the one with the real authority.
Pretty bold for a peasant girl, even if she does think she's got God on her side.
Right. Visually, it just reinforces that whole idea of Joan as not just a messenger, but like a divinely appointed leader, sent to save France.
Makes sense historically, that was a huge part of her story. But all this talk of divine mission makes me wonder, how does the comic actually portray her piety? We've seen the warrior, the leader, but what about her faith?
It's definitely there woven throughout the whole thing. You see these panels of Joan deep in prayer or having visions all bathed in this celestial light.
Ah, so they're playing up the divine aspect.
Oh, for sure. There's this one scene where she's kneeling before an altar, just bathed in heavenly light.
I can see why that one stood out to you, and it's a powerful image and definitely adds to the whole mystique surrounding Joan.
It does.
But it also makes me think about when this comic was published, 1950s America. Religion was a much bigger part of life back then.
Oh, absolutely. And they definitely play into that, highlighting Joan's piety to resonate with the religious audience. It makes her story even more compelling.
It's like they're saying, hey, she's not just brave, she's devout, just like you. Okay, but let's go back to the English for a second. We talked about how they're portrayed as these villains, but were there any specific visual cues that stood out?
Definitely. Besides those sinister expressions, they use these really dark, heavy lines when they draw the English, especially their armor, all jagged edges and shadows. And the color palette, too, lots of blacks, grays, deep red.
So visually, they're associating them with darkness and danger?
Exactly. A clear contrast with the French, who are all light and bright colors.
Like good versus evil, literally illustrated.
It's really fascinating how a comic book can layer all those historical and cultural nuances into the visuals.
It makes you think about how those same events might be portrayed differently now.
For sure.
Speaking of portrayals, one thing that struck me was how they showed Joan entering Orleans after breaking the siege. It was like this super dramatic victory lap.
Oh, yeah, they went all out on that one. She's riding through the city gates, squad raised high a banner with the fleur-de-lis waving behind her, and everyone's cheering. It's a powerful image.
You can practically hear the triumphant music.
Right. But it's more than just drama, you know? It ties into that whole idea of Joan as a symbol of French national pride, divine intervention. She's not just winning a battle, she's liberating a city, restoring hope.
So it's a symbolic rebirth for France.
Exactly. And the comic really captures that.
It's a clever blend of history and storytelling. We've covered a lot Joan's leadership, her faith, those not-so-subtle English portrayals. But as we keep going with this comic, what else jumps out at you? You know, as we've been going through this comic, I keep thinking about how they handled the not-so-happy ending of Joan's story. You know, her capture, the trial, the execution.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
Did they kind of gloss over that, or did they face it head on?
Oh, no, they definitely didn't shy away from it. They show those events, you know, condensed, of course, but it's the tone that's interesting.
What do you mean?
There's sadness for sure and a sense of injustice, but there's also this element of triumph.
So they're trying to find a balance, I guess. Acknowledge the tragedy, but still keep Joan as the hero.
Right. Especially since this comic was meant for kids. You don't want to end on a totally depressing note.
Makes sense.
There's this one panel that shows Joan at the stake, flames all around, but her face is like peaceful, almost angelic. And the caption says, "But her spirit lived on to inspire France."
It's like they're saying, yeah, she died, but her impact, her ideals, they lived on.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in death, Joan was this symbol of hope resistance, you know?
And if we think back to what we talked about before, it also ties into that whole theme of martyrdom, which was such a big part of her story.
Oh, absolutely. Even centuries later, that image of Joan at the stake, it's so powerful.
Okay, but let's be real for a second. We've been analyzing this comic, finding all these layers of meaning, but how much of it is actually accurate? Historically, I mean...
You know, it's funny because for all the liberties they took, they actually get a lot of the basics, right? The timeline, the major events, they're all there in pretty much the correct order.
So they weren't totally making stuff up.
No. The Siege of Orleans, her meeting with the Dauphin, the battles, her death, it's all fairly faithful to what actually happened.
Okay, good to know. But what about the finer points? We talked about how they simplified the military stuff, and there's obviously the whole visual style they added.
Right. Those are definitely areas where they strayed from the historical facts. I mean, warfare back then was way too complex for a comic book. And visually, they amped things up for drama.
Which makes sense. I mean, they were trying to tell a good story, not write a textbook.
Exactly.
Were there any other inaccuracies that you noticed?
The one that stands out to me is how they portrayed the whole political situation. The conflict between France and England, it wasn't just good guys versus bad guys. You know, there were shifting alliances, complex motivations.
Yeah, that's not something you can easily explain in a comic book.
Right, and those simplified English villains, while entertaining, they don't really capture the nuances of history.
But to be fair to the comic creators, they were working within certain limits. They had to condense a big story into a smaller format. And, you know, they were also products of their time influenced by the 1950s American mindset.
Definitely.
I think the important thing is that we, as readers, engage with these sources critically. You know, we can enjoy the story, but also recognize those biases, inaccuracies.
Absolutely. And that's what makes history so interesting. It's not about blindly accepting what we see. It's about questioning, comparing different perspectives.
Well, I got to say, this deep dive into a 1950s comic book has been pretty amazing. We've seen Joan of Arc in a whole new way, uncovered some historical insights, and even challenged some assumptions.
It really shows that history can be found in the most unexpected places.
So to wrap things up, we want to leave you with this thought. The next time you come across something seemingly ordinary, an old photo, a magazine, even a comic book, don't just dismiss it.
Take a closer look. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Because in those everyday objects, there are hidden stories, forgotten perspectives, a whole world of history just waiting to be explored.
So keep those minds curious, those eyes open, and join us next time for another deep dive into history.
Until then, happy exploring.